How did the Vikings meet Muslims? Their descendants surely have a lot of contact with each other in Europe thanks to this era of mass migration due to the empires of the British, the French, and also the Dutch. Wait, no, what have I done? Go back. Go. The video is also being sponsored by Vikings War of Clans, but more about that later on. So why then were Scandinavians meeting Muslims? After all, in the early Middle Ages there were no large Islamic populations near to Scandinavia. Well, in this video really I want to outline how there were two main ways for the Scandinavians of the period to interact with Muslims of the same era. Now, what I talk about mainly in my videos is the western half of the Viking world. These are raiders and traders and settlers coming from the areas of Denmark, which I discussed in a previous video, as well as those on the western part of the Norwegian country. Wow, that was natural. Okay, let's try that again. In the western part of Norway around the mountains. Now these sailed westwards and first as raiders and later as settlers, settled in places like the British and Irish Isles, as well as the North Atlantic and Francia. And most of my videos on the subject of Vikings are on this western expansion. And it's true that these mostly Danish Vikings actually also met Muslims by going west and then east. But let me get into that. So really another reason I'm making this video is because in the TV show Vikings, I think it's 2 seasons ago now, they also show the legendary expedition of the Viking leader called Bjorn Ironside, or Björn Jarnsida, to use his Old Norse name. If you'd like to lead your own Viking war fleet like Björn in the Mediterranean, then check out today's video sponsor. Vikings War of Clans was inspired by the famous strategy and RPG games of the 90s, like Age of Empires and the Total War series, that we all loved and played with a dedication that today's youngsters simply don't understand. What makes the Vikings world so addictive is that more than 20 million online players are constantly changing the way the game evolves by never-ending fighting over resources, forging alliances, and competing in live events. Don't forget to look me up and join my Vikings clan under the nickname Hilbert. And he led in 859, we're told, by various Irish, Frankish and also Moorish annals. So it probably happened, because we have it from various different independent sources, that a great fleet left Denmark around 859, or from Denmark, many of the warriors probably from Ireland or somewhere in England due to the raiding activities there. And they sailed around Francia and through to Spain. Now at this time, Spain, or most of Spain, was being ruled by the Moors, who had invaded in the year 711 after the successful Islamic conquest of North Africa during the 7th century. And these peoples were in the south of Spain when this large Viking fleet sailed around the Iberian Peninsula, and this is the first contact between them and Muslim peoples. After obviously they were the ruling classes there. There were also, of course, the more indigenous Visigothic, and before that also the Ibero-Celtic, and also the descendants of various Roman, Carthaginian, and also Greek settlers. It's a bit of a mix in Spain. It's quite an interesting history. We should probably do a video on that sometime. But those are the people they encountered. Now what we're told is that they were in the mouth of the river where today Sevilla, or in English Seville, the big city, that they were in the mouth of that river. We're not sure if they actually sailed right the way up there. However, they definitely did cause a lot of damage in Algeciras, which is just opposite the town of Gibraltar. And we're told by the Moorish annals of the time that they did indeed burn Algeciras to the ground. Now later they actually passed through the straits themselves, because the main Moorish war fleet at the time was in the east of the Mediterranean fighting the Byzantines. They didn't expect this Viking war fleet to come out of nowhere. And then they're also in the Cabo Tres Forcas, where they likely took many people away as slaves, because their interaction with Muslims, quite interestingly, is very similar to their interaction with Christians. They came, they raided, and they took people away as slaves, and they probably also did a bit of trading. I don't think the Vikings were really that bothered. They just wanted to earn a bit of cash and probably to do a bit of plundering. Another interesting thing I wanted to bring up here about this expedition of Bjorn Ironside into the Mediterranean is this passage that we have from an Irish annal. It's actually from the Fragmentary Annals, which was written in the first half of the 11th century in Ireland, and it reads, "The two elder sons of Ragnall," Ragnall is probably another name for Ragnar Lothbrok, who may or may not have existed, but it essentially is describing Bjorn and also Hastein, who was the other leader of this expedition. But anyway, they both reached Africa, and they waged war against the Mauritanians and made a great slaughter of the Mauritanians. Then they brought a great host of them captive with them to Ireland, i.e. those are the black men. For Maori is the same as nigri in Latin, that means black. Mauritania is the same as Nigritudo, which is the land of the black people. Now those black men remained in Ireland for a long time. Now it's interesting here from a linguistic point of view, because actually the word that is used by the Norsemen for the people there and that we have, and the word that is used in this annal is Blármen, which, using the Icelandic pronunciation of today, means blue man. Now, blár is the Old Norse word for blue, although it's often used for a darker kind of colour blue. So it really connotates a blue or a black man. Now, the interesting thing is that in modern Irish, they also use blue rather than with black to describe people with dark skin. So in modern Irish, the word is fish horme, which is used for blue or black men. And it's interesting that they then had to come up with new words to describe new peoples that they encountered, especially on this expedition with the north coast of Africa. This must have been, or at least the first documented case of Vikings coming and really meeting people that were very different to themselves. Of course, this would also occur in North America when they met people from a different continent. This would be the first time that they met people from North Africa in North Africa, which is just an interesting point there. While the story of Björn and the Mediterranean fleet is very interesting, it's actually only one case, and really far more contact was had between Muslim peoples and between Scandinavians in Eastern Europe, thanks to the Swedish movement down several of the rivers like the Volga and the Dnieper, and the peoples who became known as the Rus, who settled and later gave their name to Russia. These Scandinavians initially came just as traders, but later they were followed by war bands and they started to settle in various areas. Some of the most famous centres of the Rus, for example, would be Staraya Ladoga and Kiev, Novgorod, as well as Gernichov. Now, these peoples interacted first with non-Muslim people, so they interacted with peoples like the Finns as well as the Balts, and then later the Slavs. The Slavs were actually migrating north at this point. They actually came from further south in Eastern Europe, but they were moving north as the Swedes were generally moving southwards along the rivers. And it's also around this time that they first encounter Muslim populations, because the people actually buying the things that the Scandinavians brought, which were mostly furs, were actually Muslims from the Caliphate. Now, this is very interesting because far and away, by a huge margin, the most coins that we find in Scandinavia are not from England, they're not from Francia, but they are Islamic dirhams from the Caliphate. And this is because silver was very, very readily available there, and silver was highly prized by the Swedes, by traders, because it was a very portable kind of wealth, and portable wealth was incredibly important to the Vikings because they were obviously always on the move, and so they wanted to have things to buy and to barter. And as you can see in this picture, you actually see that some have been cut in half, and then other times you'd find coins that were cut into a quarter. There's a couple examples on there as well. So portable wealth was very important. So that's one of the main factors why the Swedes started to come down this way, was because there was silver to be had and furs to be sold. And after, in about 750, the Umayyad Caliphate, which has been a very violent warrior caliphate, was replaced with the more peaceful-minded Abbasid Caliphate. And these were much more of an economic-minded group. These were a lot more of the time they allowed the economy to flourish and the culture to flourish. So the elite in society wanted to have, obviously, elite goods. And, well, these elite goods would be exotic goods. And for the Caliphate, which was based around Baghdad, they wanted things like furs. And obviously the Scandinavians brought that, so that opened up a possibility for trade in Eastern Europe. Now, as well, they probably didn't actually sail all the way up to Baghdad and actually directly traded with people from the Caliphate. Rather, they had intermediary groups that they met with on various points of the trade group. So one of them would be the Volga Bulgars, who I think around the 10th century became Muslims, so they'd have interactions with them. Of course, the Rus also had interactions with the Byzantines, although they weren't Muslim, but they were connected with a lot of various peoples. Also the Khazars, some of the Khazars would have been Muslim at the time, and also some of the expeditions that they took to places like the Caspian Sea, many of them ending in complete disaster because Arab fleets at the time were very advanced. they also interacted with Muslims there and tried to exact tribute and to raid, but oftentimes the Rus found themselves on the back foot in these situations there. And another interesting point is actually that we have a few Islamic sources for the Vikings. So two of the famous ones are Ibn Rusta and Ibn Fadlan, and Ibn Fadlan is actually the Muslim scholar who was sent north by the Caliphate, and it's his writing from which we get the very famous sort of story of the classical Viking burial, where you have all of these animals being killed alongside the Lord. Then you have this slave girl who, you know, does things with a load of the lads, and then she's killed by the angel of death, as they describe her, and then it's, you know, put afloat and then set aflame. So we get that actually from that Islamic source, which is really very interesting, as well as other kind of sources on that, which I thought was pretty cool. So this has just been my video about the Vikings and how they, if they did, interact with Muslims in these two ways. Now, I've recently been doing some work on the Rus, if you couldn't tell, and I probably will make some videos about that in the future, in about 2 months' time, I think. Alright, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Huge thank you to the patrons who are all on the screen there, from the Elderman class to the Huskarls and also the Gaining. Huge thank you to them for allowing me to do this, and do check out Vikings War of Clans if you want to have a bit of Viking action in the comments below. Yeah, just go for it. Anyway, I've been History with Hilbert, this has been The History, and I'm Hilbert.